Joining us right now is Rafia Zakaria. She's a journalist who writes for the Dawn newspaper in Pakistan and Al Jazeera America. Rafia, it's great having you on. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure as always. Now, you have a piece that you wrote a couple of weeks ago, and I'm glad to finally that we were finally able to make this work, and you can come on and talk about it. The name of the piece is "Women Watching Women," and what you're talking about is a brigade that has been set up in cities controlled by ISIS, which is this really fanatical militia terrorist organization, I guess, however you want to define it, that's been rolling through Iraq and attempting to create some type of imagined caliphate. Now, you're talking about the specific role that women are playing in what they're doing, and then more broadly, why the oppression and abuse of women. I mean, we see this obviously with the Taliban or Boko Haram, and now with ISIS. What is it specifically, before we get to this brigade and some of the specifics, what is the broader context of why women are targeted so specifically and so relentlessly in a situation like this?
Um, yeah, well, first of all, yeah, it's great to be on and to be talking about this. As someone, who writes about women, both in Pakistan, where I'm from, as well as just feminism in general and the global linkages between feminists, I've been writing for a long time about how various extremist groups like Boko Haram, the Taliban, and now IS or Islamic State, as they're called, use sort of the visuals of oppressing women as a means of showing their political control over an area. And, when I started writing about this 5 or 6 years ago, when the Taliban first marched into Swat in Pakistan, this was it was unusual to see this sort of extreme and sudden clampdown on women in the public space, as well as, a very deliberate sort of tableau of either flogging women or stoning them or oppressing them, and recording that and making it available to wider web-based public was a new thing. But as we've seen the emergence of more and more of these groups, and as sadly, they have been able to take over more and more territory in places as diverse as, as I mentioned, not just Pakistan anymore, but also Afghanistan, Nigeria, and now parts of Syria and Iraq. This strategy of, showing political control by eliminating women from the public sphere has become a standard in their sort of in the agenda that they have, and also in the visuals and aesthetics of sort of medievalism and barbarism that they use to cow populations and to make people afraid. The particular article, "Women Watching Women," honed in on a particular strategy that's being used by Islamic State, in which they're basically formed a brigade of women. And as I mentioned in the article, this is not in itself something new, right? Because both in Iran and in Saudi Arabia, there are all women's police forces that kind of go around and enforce, these rigid parameters of dress and behavior on other women. So the incident that I was talking about in relation to this brigade, which is called the Al-Khansa Brigade, was in the Syrian city of Raqqa, where a young girl was walking unescorted, and she was rounded up by this brigade and held in detention for hours, where she was abused, left alone. She didn't know why she was there. She didn't know when she would be let back, and then until finally she was let go. And so, the strategy again is very similar, is that now instead of men enforcing these punishments, they've come up with this idea of using women to oppress other women. And what that does is essentially resurrect, ironically, a very colonial trope. Because as post-colonial societies in Pakistan and Nigeria, that's what the colonists did. It's, when the British came to South Asia, to what is now India and Pakistan, they used, they would select certain groups to then enact the colonialist policies over other groups in that typical sort of divide and rule metric that we're, all familiar with. So I was pointing out essentially how these groups that actually vow to be very anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, actually use the same tactics that we've seen used in these regions and actually resurrect these very colonial tropes of using selecting some members of an oppressed group to receive some power, and then use them to enforce that over the rest of the group.
Yeah, and the other thing that is fascinating that strikes me as you're talking about the power of the visual representation of this very specific type of oppression. I mean, it's very interesting if you look at the Western presentation of a group like the Taliban. It's almost actually like women's bodies and women's being erased from the public space is part of this odd kind of allure or threat in the imagery, not just a demonstration of a human rights abuse, as an example. So when you're talking about resurrecting these colonial systems, it also seems like there's this other odd parallel between how some in the West who have a particular political agenda in the Middle East or South Asia want to kind of represent certain societies in certain ways, they gravitate towards this imagery too. So there's this symmetry going on, and it's playing out through women's bodies.
You're precisely right. I mean, what I'm trying to point out first, of course, is that there are a very intentional aesthetics to the forms of domination that these groups are exercising. And it's very intentional, and it is meant to provide a very a certain kind of visual to people who are watching, both in the local populations and internationally. And the second point that you mentioned is crucial, and it's kind of a tale of two perversities, right? Because in one sense, these extremist groups know and seem to capitalize on the fact that people in the West will respond to these highly orientalized, grotesque, brutalized images in a certain way, because for a long time that's been sort of the dark corner of the Western imagination. And so it's a symbiotic sort of mechanism at this point, where they produce these visuals. They know that they're going to be disseminated widely and written about globally, and in a sense that gives them a certain kind of notoriety, and even perhaps a kind of local legitimacy, because then they're no longer local groups. IS is not just a ragtag group that's taking over 1 and 2 and 3 provinces in one part of the world, but it sort of showcases their transnational ambitions. Mm-hmm. And so, again and again, I've written about how the terms that they use, especially, and these visuals, for example, just, the sequestering of women, there is no precedent in that, in the Islamic world, even when, for example, the caliphate existed. Prior to that, Muslim women have been playing a huge role in society. They've never been sequestered or harassed in this way. But I mean, the fact is that these groups are not really concerned with the sort of doctrinal or historical or religious rightness of their actions. What they're concerned with is creating an aesthetic opposite modernity, and presenting that to the world as a sort of challenge to a certain kind of way of justice, of ordering society. And women's bodies especially have become the battleground for sort of their essential ingredients in constructing this aesthetic. So because, the women swathed in burqas or women completely absent from the public sphere creates a statement like no other. It's an instantly and radically transformed public sphere. And that has become, like I said, a cornerstone of kind of the aesthetics of barbarism or neo-medievalism that they want to embody.
Right. And so getting to the women who make up this brigade, and obviously, of course, there's a level of conjecture and speculation here, but this is another sort of area where there's some interesting possible distinctions. So in Iran, as an example, obviously the Islamic Republic of Iran does not have a good record on women's rights. Now, that said, I think especially in the beginning of that revolution, there was actually there was sort of hybrid rhetorics about giving women certain power and sort of their role in that particular type of revolution. Now, obviously, this question is, I'm getting away and sort of disaggregating from, I think we all can agree on just the kind of objective, horrific human rights abuses and cruelty to women and to everybody that is coming under the fire and the gaze of this group. But so with that acknowledged and on the table, what is there any authentic power for women in these brigades? What are they doing? What is the position that they're playing, or are they just instruments for this obviously really misogynistic policy and the aesthetics of neo-medievalism that you're talking about?
That's a great question, and I haven't spoken to women in the Khansa Brigade myself, but I have studied and spoken to women who are part of, movements within Pakistan that are very supportive of jihadist ideology. And the difficult question within that realm is that if you look at it purely from the basis of women defying convention and women creating an alternative identity for themselves that breaks out of sort of the kind of traditional role of a wife and mother, which is still very dominant in Pakistan, then, participation in these brigades and enacting and doing what they see as this sort of religious duty, it is a form of agency within that very narrow realm, right? I mean, they're doing something beyond sort of a very, very traditionally circumscribed role. Of course, for example, as I point out in that article, the Al-Khansa Brigade had no role, say, when, several weeks later after their formation, the ISIS stoned a woman, or at least there was a video of a woman being stoned for adultery. So they didn't have a role in that, they could protect that woman, which you would imagine as an all-women brigade, that would also, be a part of what they do. So then that exposes sort of the deceptions and the sort of vacuity of these concepts that supposedly, ISIS can say we empower women by making this brigade and allowing them to do this. But of course, they don't allow women to protect other women, which then again shows that basically they're just there they're just part of this sort of severely segregated realm where they say, okay, well, men can't go and talk to these women because they're men, and so we'll send women to do it. But when it comes to sort of enforcing these sort of really draconian and punishments that are really baseless, even within Islamic doctrine, the women cannot interfere within that sort of political statement that IS wants to make. So in all of these groups, you see that sort of that ceiling, right, or that limit to what they can do. The question, of course, then becomes, and I'll give you a concrete example. When I was studying one such group in Pakistan, they told me that the girls who formed and women who formed this group, which also was, going out and engaging in moral policing of other women, these are girls who have run away from very traditional backgrounds and were given refuge within a religious seminary where they were educated in Islam, and before they started to do this moral policing. So when you look at that, you think, okay, wow, these are women that ran away and decided to do something different. But the way they've defined their emancipation is to sort of curtail the rights of other women. And that becomes then a very, very complicated question. But it is definitely one that needs to be asked, because as you can see, I wrote this article maybe like a little over a week ago. Since then, there was a Nigerian female suicide bomber who detonated herself. And increasingly, there are more and more examples of women being not just recruited, but indoctrinated and then used for various sort of political aims and obviously for killing.
Right. So yeah, and you also say yourself in the article, you talk about women acquiring this certain type of limited agency means becoming a pliant instrument of male power, or men, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And but what do you do with that? I mean, ideally, feminism should prioritize gender identity. And so the women who are in these brigades, if it was truly something, should, at least at a very basic sense, also be able to protect women from men,
right.
And not just tell them when they should be covering their hair and, what length their clothes should be and things like that. That they're not allowed to do at all. So you can see just how thin and vacuous then this concept is, because essentially what they're doing is finding some women and using them to exploit a much larger number of women, and dividing that constituency so that they can never develop a collective sort of feminist conscience of any sort. But at the same time, the immediate power promised by these jihadi groups, whether it's to men or women, is very appealing, to a lot of women who do not have access to this sort of Western-style human rights discourse or to an education. And this is something that they work to make widely available precisely to those constituencies. Women who might be in very small towns have nowhere to go, who are only permitted to go to religious classes. This is something. This is a sort of path for them that's available.
Right. So, and I feel like this is where our conversations usually go at some point, and this is one of the one of the many reasons I think you're such an important writer and important voice, is because I think when we talk about all of these issues, and we talk about the Western relationship to them and Western foreign policy and or the internal dynamics, which we've been focusing on in this conversation, or how you define global human rights, global feminism, how do you engage with something like Boko Haram kidnapping those girls, and really how horrific that was, and of course the genuine human desire to want to engage and participate and do something, but then at the same time recognizing that in a lot of ways, participation can unfortunately kind of, a broader context, a broader understanding for real systemic solutions can be elusive, basically. And a big part of that challenge is how do we engage with, again, what is really just objectively an obscene human rights situation and a genuine, I mean, you talk about there's potential long-term national security threats to the West from a group like ISIS, but there's also, talk about there's a deeply immediate threat that's already being experienced in Syrian and Iraqi communities. So, this is the $1 million question of this conversation, and we're always just maybe getting threads of it. But how do we engage these issues in a Western context? Not excuse them, not sort of try to go in that other side either, where, well, everything can just be sort of explained under an umbrella of colonial history or just our own hypocrisy, as important as those things are. But then at the same time, not just using them as our own sort of, again, our own neo-colonial racist discourse to propagate all of the dysfunctional policies we want to propagate. What kind of conversations do we need to start having and actions we need to start taking to finding that third way?
Wow, that's an excellent question. And I have a piece coming out soon that I hopefully will come talk to you again about, which is precisely on this issue of what can be done. And, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I will tell you how, what I think frames this dilemma. And I think the biggest factor that perhaps is not considered, that for, when we had the Bring Back the Girls campaign or other sort of hashtag campaigns that aim to be global and address the condition of these women, whether it's, under Boko Haram or IS or any of these groups, is that I think one of the things that has deterred people from going beyond that and really asking, does this really help the women within these contexts, is the problem. We're afraid, and I would say that broadly in terms of human rights activists, in terms of people, journalists, us, commentators, we're afraid to ask that question. And that question points to the larger sort of mechanism that we believe, globally still works. And that is, we believe that naming and shaming these organizations globally, whether it's by hashtags or publicization of their crimes or, honoring the survivors of their abuses, somehow helps create moral change locally, within these communities. And the problem with that assumption is two things. One is that these groups, whether it's Taliban or Boko Haram or anyone, are not really always counting on people agreeing and supporting them. Right. They're fine if people just do what they want them to do based on fear of them. So
they're not saying, "Oh my God, we better get a PR firm on retainer."
Exactly.
Somebody at Wesleyan just put a hashtag on us.
Right. So that's one huge issue, and the other issue is that the world has been really not interested in understanding the complexity of why these people are vulnerable to these groups. And, like, for example, just what I said. I mean, why would a woman join this? Well, because she doesn't really have the option of going to a university and, taking a course on human rights and doing advocacy that way. So there are people who are sort of left out of the global discourse. And those are very specifically the ideas, the areas in which extremist groups are most popular. And that's because this is their way of engaging in a counter-global discourse. And that is contributed to by the fact that they see their own governments, whether it's the Nigerian government, Pakistani government as complicit in other crimes. So, today Amnesty released a report on the crimes of the Nigerian military against the Nigerian people. So, some of the people within that context, who are suffering both the injustices of the Boko Haram and the Nigerian military.
Right.
So, the frame through which they see something is then vastly different from the global frame where people just say things like, okay, well, let the military go and rescue these girls. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. But the fact is that we've invested so much, so much faith in the fact that our moral responsibility is limited to that click or that tweet or that hashtag, that people aren't really willing to push for a more robust form of global advocacy.
Well, that's exactly where it needs to start. Getting to that robust expression you're talking about, and hopefully, and I won't just say hopefully, I actually really do think that your writing in this conversation at least gives it some nudge in the right direction. So I really, really appreciate your time, Rafia Zakaria. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I hope to be back soon.
Absolutely. Take care.